high and one way. So turn me loose, let me loose.
I'd like to call the meeting of the Santa Barbara Ordinance Committee to order, the meeting of October 20th, and all of the committee members are present. We will take some public comment, but we're hoping to wrap up the hearings this time and be able to present the council with some recommendations. So please, if you are going to give public comment, submit that quickly. And we will start with Chris Agnoli, followed by Roy Nixon.
Good afternoon. Thanks for letting me comment today. My name is Chris Agnoli, and I'm speaking today as a concerned citizen, not representing any group. And I just want to be clear here, I'm not arguing for or against allowing dispensaries. My issue is where they should be located, or rather where they should not be located. I urge you to prohibit dispensaries from operating in existing mixed-use buildings. My understanding is that the current ordinance prohibits dispensaries near schools and parks and in residential zones. I don't understand how they can be allowed in mixed-use buildings where they have a residential element. I'm sure you're familiar with pharmacy wanting to occupy Paseo Chapala. It's just down the block. In fact, being that we're next to De La Guerra Park, I'm assuming there could be no dispensaries here. And then my understanding is this area of State Street doesn't allow dispensaries, and Paseo Nuevo doesn't allow dispensaries. And yet you're planning to allow a dispensary to go in Paseo Chapala, which is right at the entrance to Paseo Nuevo Mall, where kids are dropped off to go to the mall, where there's kids living upstairs in the residential units. And kids, I understand, are even allowed to go into the store and look at all the things through the glass. They're not allowed to purchase unless they have their recommendation and are 18 years old. But it just doesn't seem like a good mix for me. And let's face it, most of the patients that buy cannabis pay in cash. It's a fact. I'm sure Ms. LaForce would agree that this is a cash business. And this means that criminals know that people going into the store will likely have large sums of cash, and people coming out of the store will have drugs. And because of this, I understand if the pharmacy is allowed at Paseo Chapala, they'd be required to have extra security and cameras. And well, this is not what the owners, including myself, I am an owner over there, it's not what we signed up for. Owners asked me when I was representing the sales over there, what's going in downstairs? I got that all the time. What is going in downstairs? What's going in downstairs? And they're all aware of the restrictions that we had for the commercial space, which included no bar, no adult entertainment, no adult store. There's a whole list of restricted uses, and I can guarantee you a dispensary would have been one of those uses had anybody thought of it a few years ago. We paid a lot of money to buy in this location, to be able to walk to restaurants, to walk to downtown, to walk to the farmer's market, not to live in a building with the need for security guards and cameras all over the place. I urge you to please think this through. I know a lot of these people here today want the dispensary. Again, I'm not arguing for or against the dispensary. I'm just arguing it should be in a location that's right, and I'm hoping you guys will do the right thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Agnoli. And just we're gonna let Chris off the hook. I gave him 3 minutes. We're only taking 2 minutes because you want us to be able to report out to council on the issue.
My name's Roy Nixon. I'm an owner at Paseo Chapala, and of course, I'm against the pharmacy for the reasons Chris is against it. I have a slightly different take. I believe in the concept of smart growth, that we should move in from the suburbs, which I did. I had a large house, pool, 2 acres of lawn. I believe people should reduce their carbon footprint, their environmental footprint, and smart living, smart growth, downtown living, sort of in a European model, it seems reasonable, and I think it may be the future of our country. I think that if a questionable business like the pharmacy is allowed at Paseo Chapala, other middle-class potential homeowners downtown will be scared away. and I think that would be a tragedy. So I'm against that pharmacy. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nixon. Maria Dumont, followed by Kathleen Gu.
Hello. I am a resident at Paseo Chapala. I've been coming here, and me and my husband requesting that...
I'm sorry, I just want to interrupt. We're not going to be taking any more public comment. I've got to cut this off at a point. I think all of you are going to be very displeased with us if we take another month to make any recommendations to City Council. And so if we take a further public comment, we're not going to do that. Typically, you close off public comment at the beginning of a hearing. And so for future reference, if you want to make sure that your public comment is heard, you've got to fill out one of these things before the hearing starts.
Okay, then
All right. No, it's not. You did it plenty early, Maria, so please continue,
Yes.
and I'm going to... I'm going to give you your full 2 minutes back.
Okay, can I give my time to John Campanella?
Oh, that's fine.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. John, you know that, too.
Yeah, I
Come
know.
on.
Sorry.
You're old hat at this. Come on, please proceed.
Too old hat. As far as proposal that was looked at for consideration last week, as far as mixed use, not allowing a dispensary that are already in existence, just a point of clarification on CC&Rs. We have in our appeal distributed the CC&Rs in full for Paseo Chapala. CC&Rs have generality protections of the residents within. And that means illegal activities cannot occur. There's enforcement procedures by homeowners and the association, and there's also a pretty broad definition of nuisance. Okay, may not be the same as in the ordinance, but it's pretty broad relative to what's determined by the board as a nuisance. Those CC&Rs are reviewed by the Department of Real Estate, so there's full and fair disclosure to everyone. It has to be a form approved by them. It's approved by lenders before they're recorded. It's reviewed by the city as part of our submission of our final map. It's also reviewed by other homeowners. It's reviewed by insurance companies, mortgage lenders for people that are going to buy there. These are all cleared that all of these people feel comfortable in buying, investing, and supporting a project. Once they're recorded, I would think that the city would allow them to take precedence and priority over other situations that may come in existence, like an ordinance, especially if it's conflict with legality under federal law. So I'd like that to be considered in some of the proposals that you're making. Thank you.
Thank you. John, Kathleen Gu, followed by Robert Fedor.
Thank you, members of the Ordinance Committee. I concur with everything that Mr. Agnelli has stated. It was a building that our Paseo Chapala building existed before we could include medical dispensaries within our CC&Rs. We needed to put it in there, but we didn't know such a thing would be coming along about a year after our building was already constructed. The proximity I have a question on, because we do have children and families mere 18 inches above, and I just don't feel that it's an appropriate location. I urge you to allow them in the commercial CO and C1 zones. A standalone building would be much more appropriate. Thank you.
Thank you. Robert Fedor, followed by Thomas Byrne.
Mr. Chair, Honorable Councilman, I've spoken before as to the benefits that a Santa Barbara Collective Alliance could offer the community, and how the collectives, if they were to align themselves like a neighborhood council, could create a regular forum to hear the community and then work together directly with the community instead of inundating the police and the city. Today, I would like to call attention to the current revision of the application process, and specifically number 10 on the City Planning Division's Ordinance Committee report, Criteria for Issuance. In the creation of Ordinance number 5449, the Medical Cannabis Dispensary Ordinance, it is clear that the intention of Santa Barbara government is to promote local business. there is an assumption that the existing local collectives would comply and resubmit, but for whatever myriad reasons, to a large degree, that didn't happen. What did happen is an unintended consequence, which is a proliferation of out-of-town applicants. On number 10 on your city staff list, your criteria for issuance, whenever you conduct any due diligence on an applicant, the best and clearest indicator of that applicant's future compliance will be to research and to determine if the operator had a similar operating history and what the prior operating history of the applicant entailed. If the applicant did previously operate a dispensary in another California city in the same exact capacity, then the most basic criteria for your approval will be, did they previously operate their dispensary within the law? It's the best indicator of future behavior and just common sense. If an applicant didn't respect and comply with the law somewhere else, they are not going to respect and comply with the law here. If an out-of-town applicant operates with impunity and is forcibly shut down by that city's council, then that type of illegal behavior will not be rewarded with an entitlement by the city council here in Santa Barbara. A lawful applicant is defined in this process in Ordinance 5449 under Section D, medical cannabis dispensing collective or dispensary. Any association, cooperative, affiliation, or collective of persons where multiple qualified patients or primary caregivers are organized to provide education, referral, or network services and the facilitation or assistance in the lawful retail distribution of medical cannabis. Lawful retail distribution, not prior unlawful retail distribution resulting in City Council unanimously shutting us down. In addition, in Santa Barbara Municipal Code 2880090B3, it states, for those applicants operating other dispensaries within the city, that there have not been significant numbers of calls for police service, crimes, or arrests in the area or to the applicant's existing dispensary location. I believe the Santa Barbara locational confinement is an oversight. Clearly, the code's intent is not just on the applicant, if the applicant is law-abiding in Santa Barbara, but wherever the applicant operates. The code is saying if an applicant is proven to have operated illegally somewhere else under Santa Barbara Municipal Code, they are to be denied approval. Lastly, I would like to speak to local business. The city must consider and weigh to whom it is granting such a sensitive entitlement. Are they truly local? Have they sought out one-on-one meetings with the police, city planning, and the ordinance committee? Or did they fill out an application form and hide in the shadows? In other words, a transparent ownership. I have some relevant documents to submit for council, staff, and police. Again, thank you for your hard work on this revision.
Thank you, Robert. Thomas Byrne, followed by Patrick Waddell. But, folks, we're going to really have to keep to 2 minutes if we're going to get through this. Thomas?
Yes, thank you. Mr. Chair, members of the committee, my name is Thomas Byrne and I represent a locally owned and operated existing legal non-conforming dispensary because of its close proximity to a city park, and it's actually also in a mixed-use building of which I own, where we do understand the need that we do need to relocate. We have an application in another location at the moment. We urge you not to reduce the amortization period from what's, I believe, remaining 17 months to 6 months, because that puts considerable strain on securing a new location that complies with the guidelines of the ordinance logistically, and not to mention finding a landlord that's willing to deal with the dispensary. Also, I'd like to urge you to be careful not to... We do agree that there is a need for a cap number, but I'd like to urge you not to make this cap number too low, because I think this will create a monopoly situation in the hands of a few, and also only increase congestion within this particular limited number of dispensaries. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Byrne. Patrick Waddell, followed by Tony Vasallo.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairperson, Honorable Council. I'm here primarily because my concern that there might be a spiraling agenda, that it might have gone beyond what it was initially addressed as a more of a time, place, manner concern, rather than the council acting as more of a legislative body with the expansive concerns. When you do decide on this, I'd like the council to consider fairness to all parties involved, and also to what was presented as far as evidence. Essentially, the evidence shows that there is a public concern and no real hard evidence. As far as statistics, any statistic professor would have tossed out what was presented as not showing causation or even a correlation So there is a lot of hysteria, and a lot of it's based on it sounds to me like it's based on the mixed use, and I think that's a decent concern, but not to go beyond that, because as we see, a lot of ex post facto rationalization is going on, combined by this hysteria that there is causing these problems. But as normal business persons would be knowledgeable of, that it's their business concerns is not to create these problems, which the hysteria seems to reflect. And I would just like the council also to consider the cause and effect. Subsequently, the first ordinance caused the cause and effects of ostentatious dispensaries. Consider the cause and effect of limiting dispensaries or even expanding it, that people will respond to that accordingly, even if it comes to them having to grow it in their own backyard or in their own personal use in residential areas. So everything will have a cause and effect. Thank you.
Thank you. Tony Vasallo, followed by Alina Kitson.
Mr. Chairman
I'm
and
pronouncing that correctly.
committee members, I'm Tony Vasallo. The issue is really not about fairness. The issue is really not about monopoly. The issue is really not about hysteria. The issue really comes down to this, and I would respectfully request that the committee simply stay within the legal letter of state law. It's clear that the state law provides for a closed collective. Nobody is opposing a closed collective, so it's not about hysteria. A true closed collective model is not for sale, not for profit. Please hold to that. And in deference to all of the community input you had, such a closed model would hopefully be one that would allow no more than one location of the closed collective within any part of the city, and each of those parts would hopefully be far away from schools and far away from special needs facilities. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vasallo. Alina Kitson, followed by Jeff Rowland.
Hi, I'm speaking again today, although I certainly don't enjoy public speaking, because this continues to be a very important discussion to me as a homeowner at Paseo Chapala.
Don't worry, Alina. Not even I do that for kicks and giggles. Public speaking is a necessary evil.
Where a dispensary was just approved under the current ordinance. I live in a mainly residential building despite its C2 zoning. Paseo Chapala was designed and then approved by the city of Santa Barbara as a mainly residential building despite its commercial component. The Paseo Chapala condominiums were approved, marketed, and sold well before the city of Santa Barbara ever approved an ordinance allowing marijuana dispensaries. We were not given the opportunity as an association of homeowners to specifically restrict this type of business from being under our homes, and I certainly never imagined it would be a location that the city would deem appropriate to allow one. I ask that you amend the medical marijuana ordinance to not allow dispensaries in existing mixed-use buildings directly below and adjacent to where families live. Please make these ordinance changes specific to mixed-use buildings and have them apply to the current circumstances at Paseo Chapala that have created all of this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Jeff Rowland, followed by Joanna LaForce. And Jeff, I hope you probably didn't get it, but I sent you an email response.
Okay, I didn't. Thank you, though. Good afternoon. I'll keep it brief. I think we've had some pretty eloquent speakers so far. I'm another resident at Paseo Chapala, mixed-use building. We're obviously all here because we're concerned about having a medical cannabis dispensary in the building where we live. I personally believe that the intention of the ordinance was to, restrict the dispensaries from residential locations. I mean, clearly they're not allowed in residentially zoned areas. They're not allowed in residential and office zoned areas. And they're intended to be in commercially zoned areas, primarily where people don't live. I believe it was an oversight that they are currently being allowed in residential mixed-use buildings. I'd really strongly urge you to correct that oversight. If it was not an oversight, then I would urge you to make a change to the ordinance to address the current situation. People are clearly very displeased. At the approval hearing for the pharmacy a couple weeks ago. There was another developer from a mixed-use building right near ours who was there, opposing their application. I think it's pretty clear that people don't want to live where the dispensaries are. They're totally acceptable in a business setting, but they really are not acceptable in a residential setting where people live. So I urge you to address that issue. I think people have a lot of other issues which are valid in terms of caps and distances from schools and all that. I'll let them speak to those specific issues, but thank you for listening.
Thank you, Jeff. And Joanna LaForce, followed by William Leahy.
I spent a lot of time this week, and I have wonderful things for you guys to read. I'm not going to read them to you. But I hope that you will consider some of I've earmarked it, so if you have specific concerns and different things, you can look at it. This documentation is related to our staff hearing officer approval, so that you can see the efforts expended by us with regards to community relation building and the amount and quality of support, not only for our collective, but for safe access for all medical marijuana patients in our community. Just to address Mr. Agnoli's comments, we are a green, environmentally conscious business. Our cash, we also accept credit cards. It's about 70% credit cards and 30% cash, so we don't have a lot of cash in the store at any one time. As far as regarding the exempting permitted medical cannabis dispensaries from operating in existing use buildings and a possible retroactive component, I urge the committee also to rely on the work and decisions previously made by you. It is clear now, though at one time proscription from the ordinance was considered, mixed-use buildings were specifically removed from exclusion. Revising the ordinance this time regarding exclusion of dispensaries from mixed-use buildings would result in a negative effect only on us at the specific location applied for, and would be unfair to us as well as the commercial property owner who strongly supports our collective. I also want to address Councilmember Francisco regarding your concerns about legalities of dispensaries and storefront type of dispensaries. And I think there's a general misunderstanding pervasive in our community. It's been clearly stated by both California and federal authorities as recently as yesterday that a properly organized and operated collective that dispenses medical cannabis through a storefront may be lawful under California law, and that the feds will not pursue enforcement against legally operating collectives. It's simply inaccurate and confusing to the general public for certain parties to continue to insist that all dispensaries are illegal. We are a properly organized collective that plans to operate properly under the laws of California, and I encourage the Ordinance Committee to cut through the incorrect information circulating in our community and keep on track with the good work you started doing last year. Unfortunately, in the city of LA, this will eventually be settled in the courts, so I think we have a ways to go. I urge the Ordinance Committee to continue on their path of regulation as originally considered, imposing necessary caps, ensuring non-conforming dispensaries either come under regulation and close all illegal operations. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna. William Lee, followed by Heather Rim.
Thank you for this opportunity. Currently, I'm the general manager of the 3 pharmacies that are located in the Los Angeles area. Each and every one of those stores have improved the area and the neighborhood. We make a point to be involved with the community. We're very active in the chamber, EastPAC committees. We've got endorsements from the church. We realize that in order to be successful, we need to be a part of the community, and safe access for health care is very important. Last week, we sent out letters to all of the residents and had 2 days of open house that I personally had. I had brochures, articles, medical magazines, and other things, and both days, not one resident came down to even look at the renditions, look at any of the articles, or to pay any attention to what we were trying to perceive and move forward. We did send out another letter to the neighborhood people, and I had 1 day of an open house, and approximately 30 neighbors all came and all gave me positive reactions that they felt that it was very nice to see something finally coming into the location. So safe access for many people is very important, and that's what we're trying to provide. So thank you.
Thank you. Heather Lamb, followed by Jake Lee. Heather. Did I mispronounce it? I have a Heather, and I think I brought it the last name are.
That's me. And Hannah. Hi. Okay, you're going to go down. With Daddy. No. Sorry. Here. Hi. We drove up today from West Hollywood to share with you. My name is Heather. Just to share with you what the dispensary has done in our community. My daughter is almost 2 years old, and we live very close to the dispensary, as well as it's on our way to our local park. And it has really done nothing but enhance or improve our community. It's been an asset, the people. When she was born, I wanted her to feel like she had a sense of community, because it's hard to find that in general anymore. And the people there are open and giving, and it feels like a very safe place to walk by every day on the way to the park. And it has just given us a lot of comfort to have the business there, and has done nothing, like I said, but to improve the feeling. And they know her, and it's just we're not going inside all the time or anything like that at all, but it's just the walking by, and just the people are just really of value to us. And I just wanted to share that with you.
Jake Lee, followed by Shereen.
Hello. I'm Jake, and I run the Neighborhood Watch in West Hollywood, which is in Center City Alliance, which is in the heart of the city. I work with the Sheriff Department and the safety officers at City Hall. And the area that's on my watch is about a 6-block radius that surrounds the dispensary. And I've been head of the watch for about 4 years. And in the 4 years that I've been in charge, I've seen medical dispensaries come and go. And I've gotten pretty good at knowing which ones are on the up and up and which ones are not. And I drove 100 miles because I felt that this was a stand-up group. I also want to mention that they also help out in our National Night Out, which is a nationwide event that takes place against crime. I'm sure you guys are aware of that. And also that if any crime or shadiness occurs in my neighborhood, I'm the first one to know about it, and there's never been anything attached with this dispensary. And I thought you guys might want to put a face to the letter that I wrote for the pharmacy. All right, thanks.
Good afternoon. I'm Shereen Katapoosh, and I work for the Council on Alcoholism and Drug Abuse and with Fighting Back, our community coalition. I know I've spoken to you before. I won't take much time, but I did want to just let you know that I'm joined here by a number of the council board members today, concerned community citizens, and yesterday our council board discussed this issue, and last week the Fighting Back Steering Committee, which is composed of a number of community leaders, discussed this issue, and we strongly support a complete ban on dispensaries. There's nothing in Prop 215 that suggests that we need to have dispensaries, and there are collectives, caregivers and patients are allowed to grow their own marijuana. We really feel like, given the harm that comes from marijuana use and what we're seeing with our teens and their reports of drug use, what we see at Daniel Bryant, what we see in our treatment centers, that what we don't need is more marijuana in this community. So we urge you and the City Council to ban dispensaries altogether. Thank you.
I'm Bonnie Reason. Good afternoon. Everything that the previous speaker said, I completely concur with. However, if there has to be a compromise at all, then there should be a total ban on any illegal or legal nonconforming and any illegal dispensaries that exist. They have to go away. And that at the very most in this city, 4 strategically placed medical marijuana dispensaries, period. I would prefer a ban. I think this matter has gone on far too long. It's just heart-wrenching to see a community that brings in outside speakers to talk for us. Again, if not a ban, then all legal nonconforming and illegal outlets should go away, and only 4 medically sanctioned medical dispensaries in this city. And I urge you that this matter go to the City Council as fast as possible. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Derek Weston on behalf of Santa Barbara Patients Group, and I want to make just 3 points today. First, there appears to be an unspoken assumption that because there have been problems with some non-conforming dispensaries, that all of the non-conforming dispensaries are problematical, and we think that's demonstrably not the case. Santa Barbara Patients Group has voluntarily complied with every single requirement of the city ordinance, and we plan to file a document with the city demonstrating that that is the case, every single one. The only exception is that measured as the crow flies, not as one walks, they are too close to one park. And so they are, and so they're just simply not able to comply at their current location unless the ordinance is changed. But I also want to emphasize that an organization like the Patients Group has more knowledge about how to prudently, carefully, and sensitively provide medicinal marijuana than perhaps any other provider in Santa Barbara. And I would urge you to take advantage of their knowledge and experience. They have specific suggestions on how to improve the ordinance. Second point I want to make is that they are simply unable to apply in their current location. And that is very difficult because it makes it impossible for them to get in the system at their current location if you change the ordinance in a way that allows them to remain. And last, I'd like to comment that for operations like theirs, which are in full compliance with the current ordinance, it is unfair to reduce the amortization period significantly because they have incurred very significant expenses in order to be in compliance with the installation of security systems and cameras and all of those things. So if you reduce the amortization period, I think it would be appropriate to consider making an exception for operations that can demonstrate to planning staff satisfaction that they comply with all of the operational requirements of the current ordinance. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Weston. That concludes our public comment. And I will, suppose, briefly go through a recap of the items that the Ordinance Committee has discussed. We have discussed reaching a cap of 7 with only 1 in any given area. I think we should probably refer perhaps to staff to have some advice to come back to us with what that parceled up areas would be. I have my ideas, but I think staff probably knows this as well as any of us do. We have discussed an amortization of 6 months, which was to the point of Ms. Raisin, who said that the non-conforming and illegal ones need to go away. Essentially, that's what it is. It means that within 6 months, the non-conforming would have to either make a permit application to be a regulated dispensary, or they would have to go away. At the last hearing, we discussed a prohibition on previously built mixed-use buildings, but not future-built mixed-use buildings. I have a couple more items that I would want to bring up, but I also want to allow time for the committee members to bring up other issues. We also talked about larger issues, the questions of whether we wanted to restrict the model of dispensaries in some sort of bigger picture way. That was not what the ordinance committee or what the council gave to the ordinance committee to do, but we do wish to bring that issue up in general when it goes to council, which is I think Mr. Vasala's point and Shireen's point and some other folks. So I will give it to the committee members. I want to talk about security requirements before we report to council, and cost recovery in the permits. But of course, I want to be able to talk about whatever other issue the committee members wish to as well. Mr. Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to briefly highlight one of the things you mentioned, and that is our discussion of the larger context of this. Again, we see before us in a meeting which is usually rather sparsely attended, a lot of different people, a lot of different points of view, and this makes clear to me, certainly, that there are some unresolved issues here at a higher level than what the Ordinance Committee typically deals with. Typically, we are given assignments to work on the details of ordinances with clear direction from council as to what that ordinance is to be. And typically, that direction comes after substantial public input and ultimately some kind of consensus. I don't think we're at that point of consensus, and every day the legal landscape is changing. We just had an announcement from the U.S. Attorney General Holder that federal law enforcement is stepping back and leaving this entirely to the states. Now, as a proponent of federalism, I can't entirely disagree with that approach. But I believe that the dispensary model itself, in my understanding, is in conflict with California state law. That what California state law talks about is the provision of medical marijuana for patients who genuinely need it for the relief of chronic pain. It is not about retail storefront dispensaries. I think that this is an issue that has to come before the full council for discussion. And until that question is resolved, this larger question of what is it exactly we are creating an ordinance for, until that question is resolved, I have real doubts about the efficacy of what we're doing here in the Ordinance Committee. Now, that doesn't mean that I will not cooperate with what we've been assigned to do, but I really think when we go back to council today, we need to emphasize that this is obviously, just look at what's happening in this room, this is obviously an unresolved issue.
Absolutely. Mr. House, do you have any comments before we go through these issue by issue?
Well, just a couple things. We've had, and Mr. Francisco wouldn't remember, we deal with big issues here all the time, and this room is often very packed with people. You can remember the living wage conversations that went on for a long time, and the NPO. I mean, almost every meeting had at least as many people for long periods of time. So, I mean, there's this doesn't mean that we can't do some work here. We were given a task by the City Council to go through and look at some potential areas for discussion and see what we could do to strengthen the existing ordinance. Now, when it gets back to Council, and I will get back to Council, then those larger questions certainly will probably arise. I was looking and reading here in the Attorney General's enforcement guidelines, just in case anybody's interested. It says and this isn't to make a case one way or another, but just to say, you're right, the only recognized group entities are cooperatives or collectives, and dispensaries are not necessarily recognized under the law, it says here. It says it's the opinion of this office that a properly organized and operated collective or cooperative that dispenses medical marijuana through a storefront may be lawful under California law, but that dispensaries that do not substantially comply with the guidelines set forth in the sections that were above in this are likely operating outside the protections of Proposition 215 et cetera, et cetera. So there's some important distinctions there, and I think that what we're trying to do at our local level is to make sure that our regulations, local regulations, are consistent with the state law and that meet our local needs. But certainly there's caveat here, but there's an opinion that says that the storefront itself isn't the deciding factor. How it's run and whether it's consistent with these other things is. So I think we can at least go on that basis for right now, and then when that comes back to City Council, the larger body can take up these larger issues. I don't want to take that up here. I think that's two things I don't want to do here. Number one, I don't want to be an appeal board for the decision of the staff hearing officer the other day, and I don't think we should be in that position today trying to make a decision on a particular already approved, going through a process possibly of appeal dispensary. And the second thing is I don't want to fix the whole state and nation on this thing. I want to do what we were told, which was to go through these, how many points, Mr. Cato? There's several, 14. And let's see what we can do in each of those areas and give something back to council and strengthen this ordinance as we were asked to do.
I want to put this in a context, because I have been bombarded with emails about various different things. What we as a city council do is we allocate funds and we create ordinances. We are not we do not change state laws. Okay, that I may want to do that in the future, but that is not what we do. And so it is important for us to recognize that what we are doing here is essentially creating zoning requirements. We are not trying to say whether or not the state is right or wrong in how it has implemented Prop 215 or Senate Bill 420, which is the implementation legislation for 215. We had to figure out, because dispensaries started opening up all over town a couple years ago, and we had no rules permitting them. And so we also don't have any rules not permitting them. And we had to figure out whether we are going to just let it be the wild, wild west out there and let the feds and the state government battle it out and we'll just sit on the sidelines, or whether we are going to create some regulations as to how and where dispensaries should operate. We chose to try to create 19 months ago, restrictions on how and where they should operate. Again, most of the dispensaries that exist out there have existed before that regulation came into place. There is only 3 that have been permitted under those new rules, only one of which is open. So our experience with how the new regulated dispensaries will behave is very limited. That being said, there's some things that in the last 19 months we could probably say we could do a little bit better, and that's what we're here to tackle. We're not here to tackle bans and things like that cannot be accomplished through zoning restrictions. So what we have done thus far is tightened up the ordinance to be more restrictive, and we are recommending a number of things that are far more restrictive, and I think the most substantive of those has been reducing the amortization period. Our original amortization period was 3 years. We have now reduced that to a remaining 6 months, which would be about a year reduction in the amortization period. There are some other issues on this list and in my list. I don't necessarily have the same order that they have it up there, but I think some of the ones I'll handle in order is first of all, the discretion of the staff hearing officer. One issue that has come up is that often the staff hearing officer will see a sort of red flag about a location, but or some other problems, nuisance issues, but they are wondering essentially how strictly to apply those. Mr. Cotto, would you like to elaborate somewhat on this particular issue?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, it comes down to, and I've said this before in a number of different venues, it comes down to a matter of trust, right? We get an application that shows how they're going to comply with the ordinance, and oftentimes they have a full operating plan that says how their day-to-day operations are going to be, a code of conduct, or some similar thing for their patients to say they're going to sign it that says they can't consume on site or within 200 feet, and they can't resell, and a number of different items like that. And so when we look at that as staff, we say to ourselves, well, this all looks good. If they follow these, if they follow what they say they're going to do, then it would be hard to make these findings, right? If they have the security guards and the cameras and they cooperate and they kick out patients that don't comply with their code of conduct, then it would be hard for us to say we could anticipate a significant nuisance issue, or that it would adversely affect the health and safety of the neighborhood. Because if they follow through with those things, we just don't see it, right? If they don't follow through with all that stuff, then yeah, the neighborhood could certainly go to hell in a handbasket. But it comes down to a matter of trust. And the way that we operate as staff is I guess we give the applicants the benefit of the doubt. We don't have any reason to believe that they wouldn't do what they say they're going to do, and that's sort of how we operate generally as we do our work in subdivisions and conditional use permits or any number of different permits that we issue. But there's a lot of uncertainty, and there's a lot of fear because once the dispensary is in place and then they don't perform the way they're supposed to, there's kind of this due process. They have to go through an enforcement. It's not like we can walk in there and say, in 24 hours you have to close. We don't do that. They have to, we have to give them notice. They will protest it. Then we have to, go through a protracted due process sort of, process to get to a point where we'll get it to the Planning Commission, and then the Planning Commission could revoke that permit. So maybe the question is maybe our normal way of doing things and giving the applicant the benefit of the doubt is not the way to go. I don't know. We're looking for some direction from the Ordinance Committee and maybe council when that time comes on how to
essentially the question is, do we give the staff hearing officer additional discretion to decide that a given location is going to be a significant nuisance of some kind?
Yes, that's the question. Should that language be looser to give the staffing officer a little bit more discretion? This says the dispensary would not adversely affect, but if you change that to could not, just some wording like that could change things around and make it a little bit looser and give the staffing officer some more discretion. And is that something that the Ordinance Committee wants? Is that...
I guess my question is, this language, I could see that being significant language. Has just the show been reluctant to use it, or what's the...
Mr. Chair, the staffing officer has not... There have been 3 that have granted these permits so far, and none of them have been reluctant to use it, but they also felt a little bit constrained by it. They look at it and go, well, we really don't see that significant, because if they do all these things they say, we don't see it as a significant nuisance issue, so we're going to approve it. There's nothing to prove them right or wrong, And
essentially what you're asking us is whether we would like you to prepare different language that increased the scope.
Yes.
Okay.
Mr. Chair?
I, for one, could support the staff having additional discretion to determine that a place would be inappropriate for health, safety, welfare issues. Mr. House?
Yeah, the very first thing on our list was the police department statistics, and we had the benefit of some information here, previous hearing. And I think that what we learned was there was one location in particular that was really problematic, that would be emblematic of a bad neighbor in terms of the calls, not just calls for service, but the ancillary issues that were surrounding that particular location. You might help me out with this a little bit, but if you look at the other existing locations that are in what we call the non-conforming category, the ones that are in that, where we're talking about shortening the time period, or even the one that's been in operation that was approved for a little bit, that we don't have any evidence of any big significant crime spike or any big. Tell me about that, please. Would you please?
Chair and committee member House. Yes, that's true. There was one that I mentioned on the previous meeting that had their issues, and in fact is going through court now. So we're waiting for adjudication on that incident, and from there we'll look at doing maybe some potential enforcement action. But we want to get the outcome of the through the criminal justice system first before we address it through our current ordinance. In regards to the other conforming and non-conforming locations, I think they're the ones that were victimized at times. They reported the crimes. Yes, there were some other folks that patients/customers that were victimized leaving the premises. But other than that, I can't substantiate anything at this point in time. But one thing I might state in regards to crime stats that the police department is monitoring. With our newer system, we have a newer computer system. We're also now going to flag all dispensary-related incidents. So the officer, when he's taking a report, he's going to be required, because it's all computerized now, to decide whether this was dispensary-related, just like we do with gang-related incidents. Was this related to a gang incident? This will give us more information whether or not some of this crime or things that occur are real or perceived.
Okay, very good. Thank you. And my what I'm looking for, Mr. Chair, is first of all evidence or help in terms of how we might recraft this if there were specific things that we'd want to add to the ordinance. Here's an example for me, and we've discussed this a little bit, and it's not prospective. It would be in reaction to something. But let's say a dispensary had a patient or a member of the collective that abused the privilege, that broke state law and resold this, or was within 1,000 feet of a school, and by state law they're not allowed to be smoking unless they're inside a residence. It's illegal within 1,000 feet of a school. So let's say that they did that and it came to light, and they continued to allow that person to be a member of that collective. That, to me, would be grounds for their closing. I mean, it's just they have to have a very tight management system to take the information that you're generating, however that becomes public, and be able to use that when they manage their own clientele. Otherwise, then they become a nuisance for the community. So we need to find some way to create a nexus or a connection between the impacts that may be happening and their responsiveness to it. And that's not the same as you were just talking about, but it's one of the things I think we could do that would be strengthening our current ordinance. And it goes a long way towards keeping any given collective or dispensary, whatever it is, from becoming a nuisance.
Mr. House, I did want to bring that up in terms of creating a banned list that regulated dispensaries would have to keep. But I think what we're talking about is a prospective ability of the staff hearing officer to anticipate that some locations that we did not previously legislate might be problematic, or certain, it could be folks with a certain history that is not covered by the provisions of the ordinance. It could be a number of different things.
Well, the question is, do they have the discretion now to do that, or is there language that would help them with that? What I clearly want to make sure that what's being responded to is more evidentiary, like you're saying. Like, let's say that somebody comes into town that wants to open a dispensary, and they were a real problem in the previous community, or they were closed down somewhere else. Some review of the history, to me, would be a very valid, valuable help. Now, we're only going to have, if this goes through, 7 of them, and only 1 in any given location. But if somebody does come in and has that kind of a background, to me, that's a red flag. That should go up. And we don't have anything in there about that at this time, I don't believe.
Mr. Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As far as this specific item is concerned, I do believe that we should change the language in such a way as to give the staff hearing officer more discretion. The way it's structured now, it's very difficult to turn one of these applications down. And for instance, as Mr. Cotto pointed out, just changing that one word from would pose a nuisance, which is a very positive determination and not necessarily easy to reach, to could pose a nuisance, which gives the staff hearing officer more flexibility. I think that's the kind of change, if we're going to make changes to that piece of it, that we should be making. Also, with all due respect, Mr. House, the kind of evidence you're talking about is hard to get, and it's the sort of thing that would probably take years to accumulate in some cases. Obviously, we'll have some. There may be some really bad actors who make obvious problems. We'll get calls for service right there at the location. The larger problem that we've been hearing about from people in the school district who should know about this is dispensaries serving as mid-level distribution points for drugs that end up in the schools. And that's something that will take a long time to investigate, and a lot of it's just under the radar. And yet it's a legitimate concern, and I have no doubt that what we're hearing from the school district about that is correct. So I would be cautious about a standard of evidence that says we have to have this many crime reports from this location before we say there's a problem.
Well, and to
That's
that
not
point,
what I was suggesting. I was
I
suggesting
really
something
would like
completely
you guys to keep to each one of these subjects because we've got another 45 minutes, and that's if you don't want to eat.
Well, I made my recommendation on that one.
And we've only got about another half dozen more issues to go. I think the one of the issues brought up by school districts has been that people who are underage have recommendations and go in and obtain, and that is already not permitted under our ordinance. So bringing any of the non-conforming under regulation would be one way to handle that. And obviously, we want to make sure that staff has the ability to enforce that. So on the question of the staff hearing officer, I hear a yes, more discretion. I hear a yes, more discretion.
But not the word could, because anything could.
Right, and I agree with that point. Would is 100%, and I can understand how that's difficult for a staff to make that determination, that 100% likelihood of posing a problem. Could is 0.1001%, right? Just about anything could pose a nuisance. And I think what I would be looking for is something where is likely to pose a nuisance. So, more than 50%. So I don't want 1%. I don't want 100%. I want more than 50%. And is that a proposal that would be acceptable, or that we give staff that discretion? But personally, my suggestion would be is likely to pose a nuisance.
Well, I would entertain a suggestion from staff, but my point was the language as it exists today seems to make it very difficult for the staff hearing officer to turn down an application.
Absolutely,
and that's a problem.
I see that.
Yeah, and I agree too. I think that the staff hearing officer should have the discretion, and then there is an appeal process if they've gone over the line. There's a chance for it to come, or haven't been discerning enough. There's an appeal process to bring it to Planning Commission. So yes, I agree with that.
Great. So it's unanimous on expanding the discretion of the staff hearing officer. Of course, we're going to look to Mr. Wiley to prepare some language on that. The next issue is expansion to the CO or C1 zones. My personal opinion is that this is too new to have an expansion anywhere. What we're really talking about is further restrictions, not expansions. But I'd love to hear from the committee if they have opinions on the matter.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Chairman, I agree with you.
Yeah, and that one I'm still out about, because I've had a number of people contact me with the suggestion that would be a location that this is, now we're talking about around Cottage Hospital. Now there are neighborhoods
Coast
nearby,
Village Road,
Coast Village Road. Yeah, and I'm thinking more in terms of the medical center. That there's again, I'm looking for some relationship between medical marijuana dispensing of medical marijuana for that kind of use, and where the doctor's offices and the hospital and all that are. I don't think I'm ready to make a decision on that right now, and I also don't think we need to open up whole new territories in the city. That particular area, though, around Cottage, it began to make some sense as I was thinking it through, that in one of the medical buildings, I could certainly imagine that, one of the medical buildings, just like there's a pharmacy built right into Sampson, there might be something associated there as well. So, I'm not ready to go there.
But
I'm not ready to go there.
If we're not ready to go there, then I think what we will, at the very least, is not make a recommendation that we're expanding it into the CO or C1 zones. The other issue is the Milpas Recovery Zone. Isn't this already banned from most of the Milpas Recovery Zone, and isn't that, especially if we're capping it by region, not only are the spatial requirements, but then also the bans because of a pre-existing dispensary in a region, essentially the Milpas Recovery Zone would be off the table?
Chair Williams, not exactly. As the Milpas Recovery Zone, to my understanding, has not been finalized, the location, but my understanding is that it would go up to about Gutierrez. No, maybe you're right. That would be Gutierrez Street, and that would cut off just about all of the remaining area that would allow it. So yes, you're right.
So can we move on to the next one, or does the committee wish to discuss this further?
I'm sorry, what?
The conclusion is that between the spatial requirements and the regional cap.
Mr. Cotto, I think has something to say.
I was thinking that if the Milpas River Zone was put in place, then yeah, that would. But sorry, it's the opposite. Without the Milpas Recovery Zone, you'd have a 500 radius around 331 North Milpas, which would come down to about here, and that would leave the remainder of this area still available for dispensaries. So I'm sorry about that. I was confused.
Now, could you keep that area in the cap region that you bring back to us, and would that therefore take care of the problem, is what I'm suggesting?
I don't think
if that's in the same area geographically as the other two dispensaries on Milpas, and the cap is there's only one allowed on Milpas.
So if we're saying Milpas Street is the entire one region, and we allow one per that region, we already have two, so we couldn't put any more in here. Yeah, that would be true until such time as maybe these two that exist are gone, and then someone else wanted to put one in down here. In the future.
Do we want to have an additional prohibition on the Milpas Recovery Zone, or are we recognizing that the fact that if we have one allowed in a given area and we already have two, that there's not going to be a third one?
I think it's okay the way it is. I think that the regulations that we're putting into place now, strengthening the existing ordinance, is, this is going to be the key. The key is to whether we're really able to enforce our ordinance. If we're enforcing our ordinance, strengthened as it is, we're going to be very, very careful. For instance, staff hearing officers just going to, as we just said, is going to have the ability to make some real good calls on locations. And I could imagine somebody coming in and saying they want to be right next door to Casa Esperanza. That might be a red flag. So I'm thinking that we're giving enough discretion in this, and we're strengthening it. If we keep enforcing it, we should be okay.
Okay.
Just one point. So, Mr. Cotto, was the idea here, because we don't actually have a Milpas Recovery Zone yet, but I assume the point of this, what this really comes down to is Casa Esperanza, correct? And so perhaps what we want in terms of a provision, if we want to strengthen this, regardless of whether there's a Milpas Recovery Zone, is to include Casa Esperanza as one of the places that we want to surround with a radius that would be free of dispensaries. I really think
you map that, Mr.
That's
Cata?
the point.
Would you like us to map Casa Esperanza? I don't have it mapped, no.
Can you give us an approximate distance?
Let's see. Casa Esperanza's on Cacique. Oh, this is... right there. So 500 feet is about there. 1,000 feet would be about there. Because each city block is about 500 feet.
So essentially, that would conform to the size of the Milpas recovery zone.
Well, no,
proposed.
actually, the Milpas recovery zone is almost a mile as it's. Well, there isn't one yet, but as there's different ideas going around, and one of them, the latest one that seems to, at least what I was told, had some traction was the beach, Garden Street, Gutierrez Street, and Milpa Street. So it's kind of a large area.
And is there an existing dispensary within that region?
Yes, if it goes up to Gutierrez, there is one, which is 331 North Milpas, the one that is legal and operating. That's one right there.
So how do we want to handle that?
I say leave it alone. We've got, if we're going to enforce this, let's enforce it and let's be really rigorous about it. And if we have a bad actor in any area, that we close them down like that. If we have the hint that somebody has a bad history and is not going to manage their operation well, we close them. We don't even give them a chance.
Francisco?
I would suggest that we, and I suspect the management at Casa Esperanza would like this. I would suggest that we add no marijuana dispensaries within 1,000 feet of Casa Esperanza or other recovery facilities. That would make sure that at least the people who are part of the program at Casa Esperanza and are mostly on foot,
right,
at least the immediate vicinity of that facility, there's no temptation there.
Mr. Cotto, the 500 you're saying is up to about 500, and 1,000 would be up to about where?
Mr. Chair, actually 500 would be more like Carpinteria.
Okay.
And 1,000 would be about 500, a little bit beyond, or so.
Oh, okay. I could do 1,000 then. Yeah. So we will, I suppose, establish the first Milpas recovery zone, or recommend it, that it be 1,000 feet of Casa Esperanza.
How far did you say?
1,000.
You know, Mr. Chair, that at some point in the future, when those other ones go away, somebody's going to figure out that one of those locations in sort of almost an industrial area down there, away from residences, is one of the places that would be wouldn't be a big deal. I mean, just you're looking at, let's see, is the M1 zone, is that included? It's not, right?
No, the M1 is not included. Only this. So this whole area is. Dispensaries are not allowed. It's only in this kind of pinkish area that they're allowed. So that's the C2 and the CM up here behind the legend.
Got it.
And then the C2 down here.
Okay.
Now that brings up an interesting point, though.
Oh, yeah.
There's no really place in the city that doesn't have residential folks. I mean, there's no commercial district in the city except maybe La Cumbre Plaza that doesn't have residential folks. It's the only place that doesn't have residential folks is part of the manufacturing zone, which is, interesting that we didn't include that.
That's for the future, I think.
Okay, so the Milpas recovery zone issue, recommendation of 1,000 feet from Casa Esperanza. I did want to bring up security requirements and a banned list. If there is an individual that resells medicinal marijuana and is convicted of that, the police department could provide a list, I assume, of people who have done that, just like a bad check list, to all dispensaries that are permitted. Is that logistically possible to do, Mr. Wiley?
Mr. Chair, I think logistically possibly, but the first thing that occurs to me is it legal? In other words, state initiative, voter initiative, and state law allows a qualifying patient to have medical marijuana, and it doesn't say unless they get convicted of selling marijuana at some point in their life. So This could be someone suffering from cancer or something. I just don't know that, part of what we're trying to do here is weave our way through in a zoning approach the Compassionate Use Act, and the idea that we would limit it to persons 21 years or older. The Compassionate Use Act doesn't say that, and that would be, the age question I saw as a direct conflict with the Compassionate Use Act. And here I see a bit of a conflict where they haven't said that. And I think we could focus more on the dispensary and say if a dispensary has been identified as having sold to someone who resold it and perhaps on more than one occasion, that could be the basis of revoking a permit or not issuing a permit to those same individuals at another location.
But to do that, we would still have to provide a list. We would just have to we could not tell them that they can't sell to that list. But of course, if they did sell to that list, then it would be grounds for us to revoke their permit. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's what I would like to see. I would like us to provide a list of people who have resold medicinal marijuana to all the dispensaries, and then the dispensaries have the responsibility to choose what to do with that list, but that if they are known to continue to sell to folks who resell, that would be grounds for revocation of their permit. Does the committee have any feelings on this idea?
Seems like a good one to me.
That's along the lines of the thing. What I would not want to do would be have it be that if just because somebody resold it that you'd revoke, because they wouldn't be under their control at all. But the fact that they would continue to sell to somebody that was on that list, that would be of grave concern for me. So yeah, I think that's a good idea.
It's also been brought to my attention that state law requires that security companies have branch licenses in each company that the company provides services in. And is there any reason or any way that we can ensure that takes place in terms of the security companies operating on these dispensaries? My concern is, if you did have a operation that we didn't know was shady but had a reputable security company, that would become more clear that there was something wrong going on. But if we have a security company that's not acting in compliance with state law, having a branch license here in the city, that would maybe make it easier for an operation that was not intending to do good or intending to be not intending to be stringent. Does staff have any thoughts about that, or the police department?
Chair and committee, in regards to the security aspect of it, I believe it would benefit everyone, including the dispensaries and the community, that it be a licensed security company, separate and distinct from the dispensaries. Because you're right, there is a check and balance that could benefit everyone. And the other thing that I was thinking, as you had mentioned earlier, and asked Mr. Wiley in regards to the citations and whether holding individuals accountable or dispensaries accountable, one of my thoughts that immediately came up is, are we looking at a time frame when these get reviewed, such as maybe like the taxi permits? Every year these come up and they get reviewed, because it'll fall on one of us or the staff or us combined to evaluate that. And I think maybe we want to bring that back forward. So I agree with the security guards; it should be separate and distinct. But I think we probably should put some timetable in regards to the review of these.
That's a very good idea. Let's take that up next, but let's finish this idea of security requirements. So we could reiterate in the ordinance that they have to have a branch license and be a separate security company. Is that something that, Mr. Wiley, you can make sure is included in the ordinance revisions? And so let's talk about a timetable. One issue that's come up is whether staff has some review of existing permits yearly or every other year, instead of what the ordinance is, as I understand it now, is that we have provisions for enforcement, but we don't really say when those are enforced. You basically have to bring something to the Planning Commission to ask them to revoke their permit. Is that essentially what you have right now?
Chair Williams, that's correct.
So the question is, does it still behoove us to have a system where staff needs to bring a complaint to the Planning Commission to revoke a permit, or whether there should be a routine review that the show makes once a year?
Mr. Chair, one of the suggestions I
Or
have
every
is
other year.
that it wouldn't be either or. So obviously the complaint process has to have a place to go, and we should be able to respond to that. But I like the idea of the police department being, I mean, they're very, very close, and the work with the nightlife, the task force that we have that have been working on the entertainment area of town, we really have that down. I mean, there's and they actually, because of those points of contact on a regular basis, have established relationships with the owners and managers, and there are learning or teaching moments that come up during that as well. So having an annual review of some sort, I think that could be very good. But I'm thinking of it more on not staff hearing officer or zoning, more on an enforcement side, a relationship with the police department, and I think that could be constructive in a variety of ways.
Well, I think the show will do that with a representative from the police department.
I'm thinking of a
if we
different
want to
model,
specify
though.
that.
I was thinking of a different model, and maybe Mr. Martell would want to speak to that. But the relationship that's been created with the bars and the dancing establishments and all has actually been a productive one, proactive, avoiding problems, training people well, the responsible beverage server trainings that you offer, and who knows how that could develop over time. But my goal would be to avoid problems, not just react to them. So if there's a way that an annual review, just like when the fire department comes and does their review for fire safety, and they make sure you've got your plugs right and your, all your store is fire safe. What do you think? Is that something like what you're suggesting?
Yes, Committee Member House. Yes, kind of more of a proactive approach, but holding them accountable. And actually, it should be written in the ordinance that we have the authority to do so.
Sure.
And I think that would benefit everyone.
So you'd be reviewing what happened during the last period, and you'd have a chance to hold them to account for strict compliance. And you'd be looking forward to how to make things even better and work with them on how to even be a better neighbor or citizen.
And that's correct, and you're right. It's helped in the downtown area and the bars and that entertainment district, because we have that alliance and working together and holding them to the their feet to the fire when things actually occur on those moments of notice, because they know it's in writing, it's there, it's in the ordinance.
Mm-hmm. And if there's something that you find that's out of order, you give them some fairly short period of time to comply when you're working with the folks you see down there. If they become a problem where you keep going back and they just aren't complying, you have the ability to kind of call it.
Yes, and that's where I believe then the staff hearing officer will come into play.
Okay.
Well, I could see that review would be good. Is it logistically difficult to do that yearly, or would it be by every other year, or what does staff have a particular recommendation on how often that takes place?
Mr. Chair, can I ask a question?
Sure.
I'm not sure who would hold this review. Would it be the Police and Fire Commission? Would it be police department staff? I'm just listening.
Look at him. What would be the recommendation?
Well, I would recommend that it be jointly done because there's different avenues of it, and I believe that the community development as well as the police department need to work jointly on this.
So are you recommending that a representative of the police officer and the show jointly hold this review?
That's correct.
Okay. I think that would be more logistically possible than a advisory committee public hearing. A staff level public hearing would be, I think, logistically possible to accomplish yearly.
No, I think it's good. One of the things that I wondered about that I didn't see also is the ability for and they would have the right to do it anyway, for the police department to just spontaneously be checking things out. I know that we've done for places that sell alcohol. There have been little sting operations that have revealed the places that don't look for an ID, for instance. And I think we've done that recently for compliance with some of these that have just popped up out there, and you've been able to find, the dispensaries. So the police do have that discretion now without us adding any more language, don't they? Yes? Okay. Good.
Okay. One other issue that has been brought up by the public is a measurement of the 500 feet as crow flies or as the person walks. Is that something that we wish to change? It does make some sense to have it as a person walks, but I don't know if that's something that the committee wishes to have.
Mr. Chair, I don't know how we would ever do it as the person walks. There's different ways, and we've got radius requirements all throughout the zoning ordinance, and they're always straight line, property to property line. I wouldn't
So just too much precedent on that.
Okay. I have a question for Mr. Wiley. Mr. Wiley, we had that one situation, still do, I think, that's non-conforming right now, where the proximity to the park is the proximity to the fig tree on the other side of the freeway. And I think that's one that begs the question, and it actually makes me wonder if and where there is the opportunity to make a call on something like that that's just in the face of common sense. I mean,
well,
where would that discretion come
One
from?
simple answer might be to build in a Highway 101 exemption on the radius requirement, because it is a pretty big barrier. But the alternative, and really sort of the other end of the spectrum, would be to allow for modification of the radius requirement. And I wouldn't recommend that, because it would just, in a way, open the floodgates for applications. And it would be too broad. I'd suggest that if really the only example we can think of is where Highway 101 separates the park or whatever, the school, from the application, that we perhaps allow the application. And that,
allow that to be considered.
Right.
Because, there may be other circumstances that make it inappropriate.
Right.
I was just thinking on a practical basis, that particular location and that proximity didn't seem to make any sense, that's all. Okay.
Okay, and can we just put up your list one more time, Mr. Cotto? See if I'm missing anything. I think I'm just going to ask if there's any other. Oh, I definitely wanted to handle full cost recovery. I do believe that no matter what, we should be having applicants actually pay for the full cost of the processing of these regulations. I, for one, wish that to take place, because I don't think that taxpayers need to be subsidizing the approval process for these things. So,
I support that. Sure. And then I had a related.
Shikata?
Yeah, just a quick question. That includes appeals, right? Which would be different than our normal process. The appeal process, a neighbor can file appeal for $300, and then we just process the whole thing for $300. That's what we do now. But one option is for if whoever files the appeal, the applicant would pay the full cost of that process as well. That's an option for you that was in the staff report. I'd like to get your feedback on that.
Here, I just want to mention that under Prop 218, we can do this, but we just have to do it the right way. And it really it will start with the finance department and some sort of study of how much time is typically involved. And I would think that typically we do an average. The average would include some appeals. I think you know that there's a larger issue, probably outside of the time we have here, on how much we charge appellants, and because it really can depend on who the appellant is.
Right.
And that'd be a long discussion. But I think to do full cost recovery, we'll need to do some sort of financial study as to how much time's typically involved, and including this review, this annual or biannual review, and factor all that in, and I think the appeal period should reflect that in some way.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I think that if that's calculated as part of the average, that's fine.
Yeah, that's a good way. Mr. Chair.
Yes.
I have something I don't know quite where to hook it on, and Mr. Wiley's probably going to help me and tell me I'm all wet on the idea, but I got it from speaking to our superintendent of schools, and it maybe it's just something that comes along voluntarily or as part of that good neighbor thing for any given dispensary, but there is a big need in the schools for the kind of counseling that assists young people in making good decisions with regards to substances like alcohol, which is their primary issue on the campuses, and it would be all sorts of other things like this, making decisions as a young person on marijuana or any other drugs. So drugs, alcohol, any of that kind of thing. And the funding is dried up, and the counselors are going to be reduced to almost nothing at the school level. And so looking forward, they're looking for some place to be able to recover that and keep those services for the young people to make these decisions, these good decisions in life. And it's been very successful. They can point to successes. Now, the cost is about $45,000 a year a counselor. And when we think about the concerns that we've heard raised here, I don't know how valid they are particularly. On the other hand, if you have 18-year-olds that are able to acquire marijuana, are still in high school, I'm just saying that there may be some kind of a nexus here in terms of a requirement of some sort of contribution or participation. Now, you may tell me that's a tax or something, but it was brought up, and I promised to bring it up in this hearing right here, right now. So,
hallelujah! I've been wanting to tax it for a long time, but
sir.
Well, yes, you're right, Councilmember House. It would strike me as possibly a tax. Under 218, a city can charge a fee for a service. Someone comes to us, whether it's someone who wants to play softball in a rec league or someone who wants to get a dispensary permit, they come to us and we can charge a fee for that service of processing their application. But even 218 says you better be able to prove that you're not charging more than the cost recovery for that actual service. So this isn't what you're suggesting here with maybe a monetary exaction wouldn't be a fee, just by definition.
Okay.
And then what is it? Under 218, it would sound very much like a special tax.
Understood. I promised to bring it up. I also then maybe it's a chance to make an appeal to the public at large who wants to support the school district in that, because it's a very important and vital service, and they may be losing the funding for it. Thank you.
That's right. Members of the public, whether they operate
share.
a dispensary or not, can feel free to make contributions tax deductible even to the school system, I believe.
All right. Thank you for indulging me on that.
Any other issues on this list that the
I had a
committee
clarification issue on something that was early. I'm sorry.
Yes, Mr. House.
You'd use the words with regards to mixed use. You'd use these words: previously built mixed use, or not future built mixed use. And I think that in our first discussion about mixed use, we had a big discussion about proximity to residences and proximity to residential neighborhoods, residentially zoned neighborhoods, and we made the distinction that we were not going to include mixed use as a category. Then, more recently, we've talked about this with in mind that there's situations that are in existence right now where there are mixed use facilities where this hadn't even been discussed, hadn't even been thought of, and the people that are living there and their management haven't had a chance to build into their CC&Rs any sort of a consideration of this at all. So that's the existing situation that we're talking about. But going forward, I don't know that you were intending to make off limits any commercial property, because remember, the mixed use is in a commercially zoned area. So any commercial area on the ground floor for future mixed use, I didn't think that's what we were saying. And I certainly
that's the problem that I indicated, is that because we have pyramid zoning, because any commercially zoned area in the city can have housing, that means that essentially everywhere could become completely off limits.
Yes, so I didn't think you were going to that extreme.
No.
Okay.
I'm just repeating what I thought was the conclusion of the discussion in the last hearing, and I would love for you to make that very specific so that staff can bring that back to us. My understanding was that it was the will of this committee, and I have some mixed feelings about this, mixed feelings about mixed use, is that the prohibition on, that this would be a prohibition, a retroactive prohibition on mixed-use buildings, but not a prospective prohibition on mixed-use buildings.
Well, I'll share.
I've never really heard of doing it that way.
I'll share with you my concerns right now. I'm the one that brought it up last time. I do have concerns about this retroactivity thing, and I just put that on the table for discussion, and I'd like some assistance with it because we've got a process that people go through. It's very rigorous for getting the permit to have a dispensary or this collective or whatever it is. And as a business guy, it's kind of hard to come in and want to put on somebody else a requirement that goes back in time when they've made decisions based on an existing ordinance, and then we create a new ordinance, and then we go back to a time after they've already made decisions based on the existing ordinance. So this is a very awkward zone for me to be in, and I would like to be sure that we're, first of all, even able to do it, and then maybe just have a conversation about whether it's wise to do. So this idea that somebody would have had an existing ordinance under which they rent a property or sign a lease, and during that period of time they make decisions, and then they get even an approval for operating, and then after that a new regulation goes into place, and it somehow goes back and wipes out their investment or all that they've gone through. That's a serious concern that I have about this approach.
Well, I'll because in the interest of time, because I asked this question of the city attorney ahead of time, he's going to very eloquently tell you why he thinks we can do it. It's not a question so much of whether we can, it's whether we should do that. Is that
correct? There really is a policy decision on it, but legally, zoning ordinances have retroactive effect all the time. Maybe Danny can tell me if we've got any existing permitted operating dispensaries in mixed-use buildings currently.
Chair Williams, we have one at 100 West Haley. It was Thomas Byrne who spoke today.
I'm sorry, what was the address
That's not a permit.
100 East Haley, that's a non-conforming. Oh,
yeah, they're not.
No. Oh, wait a minute. 631, all of it is permitted, and that is a mixed-use building, in fact.
So we might have an issue. And another point is it would be fundamentally very unsophisticated business practices to sign a lease on the basis of a use that requires a permit from the city to sign a lease before you get the permit. No good businessman would ever do that. So, the first thing you do if you're going to start a business is get your zoning permits before you sign your lease. So we've got one instance where this could be an issue if we had retroactive effect. And let me explain what I understood the committee had sort of directed last time around. Because this can be dealt with by the private property owners through CC&Rs, prospectively, the city doesn't necessarily have to deal with it. A new building constructed in the future could deal with it in their CC&Rs. So the issue becomes existing buildings. On the date of the adoption of this new ordinance, we could have a provision that says any building for which a certificate of occupancy has been issued on or prior to the date of the adoption of this ordinance as a mixed-use building cannot be a location for a dispensary. Then we'd have one permitted operating legal dispensary that maybe was pre-existing legal non-conforming. The question would get back to any amortization period or grandfathering provision. And again, you have a policy decision to make. You wouldn't even necessarily have to impose an amortization period. You could say they're grandfathered in indefinitely, still subject to all the operational requirements. It's not uncommon to grandfather in a pre-existing legal use indefinitely. Or you could impose an amortization period and require them to move. Typically, these are tenants, and it's not like you're dealing with someone who actually built a building in reliance on a city zoning ordinance. No.
So am I correct to know that this essentially would still, even though our largest level of retroactivity that we could affect would be back to May 20th?
I'm sorry, in this case?
No, I mean, in changes to the ordinance, because we did not even start discussing this until May 20th, July 20th. Okay, July 20th. Then we could not,
Yeah,
we could not make it. So the earliest retroactivity that we can accomplish with this discussion is July 28th. And the question is, if we did do that, then this would not only affect the one prospectively going into Chapala, but could also affect the one going that is already in operations at Olive.
Right. The Chapala one hasn't been permitted, so
right.
They're on their own. They have full knowledge of what's going on since July 28th, but the Olive one, I don't know what their timing was. And at a minimum, they might have a fairness argument for maybe a longer amortization period or for being grandfathered indefinitely.
Mr. Cotta, do you look like you have some input on that?
Well, I was just going to say that because there's no moratorium or internal ordinance that's preventing any of these applications from going forward, if the pharmacy were to be approved at the Planning Commission, then that would be a second dispensary that would be in a mixed-use building. And
I can tell you right now, we're probably going to recommend that it not be approved, that it be continued until we get this ordinance sorted out. At a minimum.
And so does that mean what you're saying is that we would not need to have retroactivity?
No, I think we might need it for this Olive location, but as we're going through the process, and if we've been talking about mixed uses, and it's clearly on the table. My view of it is to recommend to the Planning Commission that we not approve any new mixed-use locations until we get everything sorted out.
Well, so here's my challenge to you both, is that it seems to me that what you're trying to deal with is one example, which is Chapala. I do have some problems about creating a rule citywide because of one example. Usually when we say there's one example that we don't like, we ask the Planning Commission to reject it, right? We say that's one instance, so you act on decision makers to reject it instead of creating a rule citywide that now has even collateral effects of affecting a dispensary that already could say they have vested property rights because they moved in and they brought their things in operation. Mr. Francisco.
Mr. Chairman, I really don't think that's the issue. I think that certainly we have an example before us and we've heard a lot about it, but this is not at all focused on one building. This is focusing on all existing mixed-use buildings. That's what we're talking about. We're not singling out a particular parcel. We're talking about all existing mixed-use buildings, and we're talking about it specifically because the residential portions of those mixed-use buildings, the owners purchased property there, and the existing CC&Rs could not have anticipated marijuana dispensaries.
No, I understand that.
So it really would apply to all.
So is the desire on the committee's part to prohibit these on existing mixed-use buildings
at the time of adoption?
At the time of adoption, and to then therefore render any existing ones non-conforming. And is that non-conforming in the sense that most things are non-conforming, in which case they're grandfathered in, or non-conforming in the case in which they have an amortization period, which is this thing that we don't use very often, but we have used for the, existing dispensaries. So if you do that, then you're saying to the Olive location, you're going to have to move at the end of the amortization period.
Yeah, that's the whole thing gets really nutty for me because yes, if we had a number of them that were sort of in this kind of gray kind of area, I'd almost rather see the process play itself out and the project that's being proposed and going through its appeal process and everything stand or fall on its own merits, because we've got another dispensary that's operating now, and I suppose quietly, or we would have heard a whole lot about it. Am I correct in saying that? Are we, Mr. Martell?
Are we talking about 331 North Milpas?
No, we're talking about
Olive. The one that's on. Oh, that maybe hasn't even opened yet.
Hasn't been constructed, so it's going to be like a remodel of some sort.
I see.
I thought the Olive location was open, Mr. Cotta.
Mr. Chair, it's not open yet.
Okay.
The one that is open is a non-conforming one, 100 East Haley, that is in a mixed-use building.
Uh-huh.
And to add another complication.
And that one is going to have to go away anyway.
Correct.
And another complication?
Another complication. What if it's a rental building and a mixed-use building that one person owns and they have the ability and tenants, residential tenants can move in and out? That's a little bit different than the condo where they've bought in and it's not so easy to just move. You know?
Okay, so for sure we're not saying going forward that mixed use is off limits. So we're leaving that alone just like we have it in the current ordinance. Am I correct? We're not messing with that looking forward.
Right.
And then we have this one that was already approved in a mixed use building. It hasn't opened yet. That would become a legal nonconforming if we were to be retroactive in this, because it would apply to all buildings, right, Mr. Francis? It would be for everyone. And really, we're doing this for one particular. In reality, in practicality, this would be being done for just one project.
I guess that's my point.
It's general, but there's really only one that would exist.
That's my point, and I've had this problem that has been brought up by Mr. Cotto is that because we have pyramid zoning, any commercial property can be residential. So if you have an existing one there, all it takes is someone moving in and renting a part of the parcel for a residential use, and then all of a sudden the business that was there is all of a sudden non-conforming. So, I suppose the people who want to get rid of dispensaries could just start renting little rooms in every commercial building in town, and they can get rid of all the dispensaries. I mean,
Mr. Chair,
I'm just throwing out this problem of pyramid zoning. It's a real significant
Mr. Cotto
issue.
raised a good point. When I use the term mixed use, I'm thinking of a condo, and I think we should be specific.
Okay.
It really is a particular condo problem, as I'm understanding it. So someone who owns a building that has apartments upstairs and retail downstairs, but they own it and it's not condominiumized, I don't believe we have a concern there. If someone rents in that building, presumably they know what they're getting into, and they can, not do it or move out or whatever. I mean, at least that's one approach. But when I use the term mixed use, I think I'm more referring to a condo type arrangement. And I would have to say, I don't think we're doing this because of one location. As Mr. Francisco said, that happens to be the example that we're hearing about right now and has focused us on a particular concern of proximity to someone who's living there. But we could get other applications down the line, and the concern's probably not going to go away.
Okay, well, I think there's a misunderstanding here. Mixed-use buildings that are in existence now that have condominium arrangements above. I don't think that you're hearing a proposal here to prohibit medical marijuana dispensaries in those for the future.
Yet.
No, that was what brought me into this conversation, why I raised it, because the language indicated to me, made me think that what was being suggested was that existing mixed-use structures were going to be prohibited from having rented downstairs, like in this particular thing, a medical marijuana dispensary, if ever that were to come around. And I didn't hear that I didn't suggest it last time. We had discussed this at length the first time, and we said that we've already got it squared away that mixed use is not off limits for medical marijuana dispensaries. We decided that the first time this came around. Right now we're discussing it because we had this situation. We had a number of people come out here and they were concerned about this one in particular. And I tried to generalize it, but in fact, it's not generalizable. The only one that would be affected would be this one particular proposal on Chapala Street, looking backwards.
Okay.
So there's two different worlds, and you'd suggest, and I just wanted to be sure it was very clear before we left this and went to City Council.
Well, I do want to clarify that because the reason why I keep on needling is I am trying to tease out the detail of what it is you two want to do about mixed use.
Could I say what it is?
Sure. Thank you, Mr.
Thank
Francis.
you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What I'm talking about is saying that for all existing mixed-use buildings at the time of adoption of this ordinance revision, all existing mixed-use buildings, specifically limited to those with condos, not just apartments, as Mr. Wiley said.
So you're saying all mixed-use buildings that have for ownership
yes,
residential units?
Absolutely. Right.
Okay. That's what I was trying to tease out, that detail. Okay.
Exactly. And so this is not applying to one building. This is applying to all existing mixed-use buildings with ownership residential units in them.
And I wasn't going there because at any point in the future they could work out whatever new arrangements they felt they needed to work out, but I wasn't going there. I was not going to all existing mixed-use buildings in my comments last time, so I'm not sure that I would support that. I would go with our original recommendation, which was to exempt mixed use. It's just, it's just the most important thing for me in this, and I think I've heard so many people comment to me, is that if we're going to use the regulation approach, now the big decision maybe have to be made at City Council level for something else. If we're going to do regulation, we do it really, really well, and we enforce it super well, and we make sure that we keep them in line and make sure that they become really not a big deal, good neighbor, the whole thing, if that can be done. So that's why we're all putting so much effort on this. I don't believe that mixed use should be off limits in the future, or even for those that exist right now. It's just we have this one particular situation, and that's where I feel like we could get ourselves into trouble if we're doing all this for one particular place. I mean, it seems like we're setting ourselves up for a lawsuit. That's my worry.
So,
Chair, I guess I misunderstood, Mr. House, about what you were saying, because let me be clear. An existing mixed-use building with condos above, and we've got probably a couple dozen already in the city, can't change their CC&Rs once they've recorded them. It's extremely difficult, needs basically unanimity. And the issue we're dealing with is that you've got a different owner owning the retail condo versus the residential condo. And at this point in time, for these existing buildings, as of this date, it's not going to be possible really for any of them to change their CC&Rs to deal with this issue of dispensaries, which was unanticipated. So I understood you to be talking about those concerns. New buildings in the future, new developers can put this into their CC&Rs or not. It's up to them.
You're excluding rentals too, which is the new.
Well, yeah, because you don't own it. You can either pass on that lease or not, or pass on that month-to-month agreement or not.
Well, it seems like we are not getting to a specific recommendation to council on mixed use. I mean, are we?
Well, would you support my recommendation?
To me, that your recommendation, it kind of depends on what you do with a non-conforming use under the new ordinance. What are you proposing to do with a non-conforming use under the new ordinance?
Well, if that's all it takes, what would you propose? An amortization period?
I would say that we are creating a host of very strong restrictions. And the way that typically in land use, restrictions like the downzoning that took place 30 years ago in the city, how that is implemented is very slowly. As any parcel is rebuilt or as any parcel is re-rented, those come into conformance. this thing with an amortization period is all a little weird, right? It's not something that how we normally do land use. So I could support a prohibition on mixed-use buildings if that was grandfathered in the normal manner, and that when parcels are redeveloped or re-rented, then that is the trigger for the use.
Okay, well, as I believe we're talking about exactly one instance of a currently operating dispensary, I suppose if that's what it'll take, I can live with that.
Okay. All right.
Explain it real. Make sure I understand it too.
So the proposal.
I don't get it.
The proposal is the proposal is that there is a prohibition on existing mixed use, but that is that would render any that are permitted non-conforming in the traditional sense of what non-conforming is, which means that they are legal non-conforming, they remain in existence until there is a change at the location. And when there is a change at the location, then they have to come into conformance.
So change at the location.
Yeah, the example is, an example is when a building is reoccupied or sold, then somebody has to conform to the new, new setback requirements, new whatever requirements that the city has set.
Okay.
And I'll just point out, that's an existing city ordinance. I think it's actually got a provision in it that says if it's a non-conforming use, and there's non-conforming structures and non-conforming uses, but under the non-conforming use ordinance, if the use is discontinued for 30 or more days, it loses its pre-existing legal status. We wouldn't even have to change the code if that's what you want.
It sounded very familiar to me.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mr. Cotta.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, that's not exactly right. In our normal non-conforming ordinance, the non-conforming use has to be vacated for more than 1 year in order for not to be able to be reestablished. What we did in our current medical marijuana dispensary ordinance was to say you can't change ownership and you can't stop operating for more than 30 days. So that would be the way. It sounds like that's the way you'd rather go than the regular non-conforming.
And does that therefore eliminate the need for a retroactivity? Because because then then essentially the Planning Commission has the determination of whether to go forward or not.
I'm not sure I follow, but I think it would eliminate the need for retroactivity on this point. It would simply say that going forward, if this you couldn't do this, I'm sorry, it wouldn't even deal with this, would it? Yeah, well, we'd have a provision that said buildings, mixed-use condominium buildings in existence on the date of the enactment of the ordinance could not be dispensary locations, but make it clear, because we'd want to, that ones that are pre-existing legal may continue so long as they don't discontinue their use in reference the 30-day discontinuance provision.
Right.
So is this committee in agreement on that?
Yes.
Yeah,
that is a miracle.
I can see that. And the CCNRs, the covenants, are not. You can't just change them. They're solid. It's so different. And my biggest
concern. It requires
concern,
unanimity, and that's typically extremely hard to get.
And also, when we use the word mixed use, you're going to have to make some distinction when you write this up, because the rental apartments above is really important to have excluded from this.
But the concept of a condominium is readily ascertainable, so we can use that.
Thank you.
So, there's one more issue to bring up that has been brought up by the citizens' initiative and by staff, or by the citizen proposal and staff, which is the question of appeal to City Council. Since we have 5 minutes and I'm not going to be able to eat anyway, so let's try to handle that issue. Right now, these issues are appealed only to Planning Commission. I suppose that's based on sort of the precedent that most reoccupations of commercial uses are not discretionary decisions, period, anyway. But the question is, should there be appeal to a higher authority? I suppose is what some people term the case of. I'm not sure if we're really a higher authority in any sense of the word, but whether there should be the conclusions of Planning Commission should be appealable to City Council.
I believe they should be.
Mr. House, do you have any viewpoint?
Well, I had argued not for them not to be, but only because I thought that again, my emphasis has been on the actual implementation, enforcement, and the regulations, and getting these things so well organized that we don't need to have it be. And I don't want it to be politicized either. I thought it should be handled at a political level, if at all possible. But
yeah, I have mixed emotions about this. So maybe you guys could try to convince me on one side or the other. I view the advantage of appealability to City Council is just that citizens get recourse. The disadvantage is we are inundated with an amount of appeals that are already, even without medicinal marijuana dispensaries being appealable to council, that's already basically taking up about 50% of our workload right now. And the question is, how much more is that workload going to expand? And I guess the other question is, I've done, land use stuff both here and in Ventura for a number of years. I've never seen reoccupations of a commercial space that are zoned for being discretionary decisions. I've never seen that happen before. It's not discretionary for anything that's zoned for. So, right now I am battling a Walmart down in Ventura because a pre-existing commercial space was there. Walmart can just move in. I have to jump through all sorts of hoops to try to stop Walmart because generally zone for uses are not discretionary decisions on the part of a city. They're because the previous thing was a zone for use. So I'm just trying to figure out,
Mr. Chairman,
a larger picture of
Sure.
whether we make that appealable.
Sure.
Or not.
Here's my 30-second summation why these should be appealable to City Council. The whole problem we're facing here is this is not a simple zoning issue. It has a host of other issues that involve the community in many different ways associated with it. I believe that the only just way to deal with this is to allow the appeals to go to the policy-making body. That's the whole problem here. This is not a simple zoning problem. We've got all kinds of peripheral issues associated with it. And that's why I think it needs to be dealt with at the policy level, ultimately, if people want to appeal it to that level.
Do you have any
question
thought,
I
Mr.
have is that the thought of I was trying to make that distinction in the beginning, was that these are not policy issues. These are basic land use issues. You've got land uses that are much more noxious than these that are just over the counter. And the idea that this would become a big policy issue each and every time somebody would make a proposal within this, but I'm basing it on that we have these restrictions. A relatively small number in the whole city and a limit for each geographic area restricts it significantly. So for me, these should not become big policy issues every time. If there's a policy issue, it should come to City Council. Do we allow them? Do we need to relook at the zones that we're allowing them in, or the restrictions? In general, that should definitely be at City Council level. I didn't feel that these were the kinds of things that required a policy decision every time somebody made an approval, made a request.
You guys are both really good. Where I'm going to side on is the idea that if we create this ordinance correctly, it should provide better guidance, better leeway for staff to head off problem issues, and therefore should not need a policy decision every single time one application is made. So I will side with the idea of keeping it how it is. But you can keep on trying to change my mind. I will. I'm still a little bit undecided on that. So the recommendations and how this is going to work, just so that the public knows, is we have a set of recommendations. That set of recommendations then has to be transcribed in a written format, which is done by the city attorney. I also think we're supposed to have a review by planning commission and then it will go back to council. I want to summarize this for the record. A cap of 7, 1 in any given area. We want staff to give us some guidance of what the area boundaries should be. Amortization of 6 months. The prohibition on mixed-use buildings, but with the non-conforming treated in the way where it has to be a change of use before it's changed. And then we're going to bring up the larger context of the question of collectives and the intent of Senate Bill 420. Expanding the discretion of the staff hearing officer to